This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today we're going to talk about two different ways to break down the argument prompt, and I'm going to bring in a very good friend of mine to do that with me. So why don't y'all stick around? All right, we are here today, and I am super grateful to be joined by a really good friend of mine named Crystal LaLiberty. In fact, I've mentioned her name before because last spring when I started to begin doing synthesis videos, I talked about arguing ideas and not things, and that is a line that actually comes from Crystal herself. But I don't need to introduce Crystal because she can introduce herself. And Crystal, we're super thrilled to have you here with us today as we talk about breaking down argument prompts. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into that?
Thanks, Tim. My name is Crystal LaLiberty, and I'm an English teacher here in Massachusetts. I've been teaching AP for about 10 years now, and Lang is my absolute favorite.
You started as a Lang teacher, though, did you?
No, I started as a lit teacher, and I crossed over to the dark side, and
that's
hesitantly.
when we first met.
Yeah, we met at a training for how to be lit teacher. Well, not how to be lit teachers, but for teaching AP Lit. And I did a year of that, and I loved it. And then I was voluntold that I was going to be teaching Lang. And since then, it took me a couple of years to really make the course my own, I have to say. But since I've gotten my hands into the course, I don't think I want to teach anything else, you know?
Yeah. No, trust me, I do know. Now, you also work with teachers besides students, right?
Yeah, I work for a couple grants, Mass Insight Education, National Math and Science Initiative, and just offering my help for teachers who like the challenge of being able to take the really complex content of AP and make it accessible for all kids. So that's what I do. Excellent.
Well, I'm once again super thrilled to have you here, and I'm going to ask that you actually share your screen because what we're going to do is we are going to let our guests share first. So today, once again, what we're doing is we're just talking about how can we actually get kids to break down and access an argument prompt. And to be quite truthful, Crystal and I have been friends for a long time, and we do things in a similar manner, but we don't do things exactly the same. So I wanted to give everybody the opportunity to see two teachers who engage with argument, who do have kids that score well on the AP exam, and just say, here's how we actually get kids to engage with the prompt so that they can actually then, find good evidence, create strong thesis statements, and eventually produce excellent papers, which is what we're going to head into later on in our video series here as well. But Crystal, why don't you actually just walk us through here? And if I have any questions, I'll just chime in. But I'm going to just trust that you've got something good here, and I can't wait to see it.
Sure. So before we get into the actual prompt itself, as we go through the breakdown, I'm going to be talking about abstract ideas versus concrete things. As Tim mentioned, one of my taglines is we argue ideas, not things. And this is a central premise that I basically really try to reinforce with all of my students from the beginning of the course, that we live in basically two realities, if you will. And this feels a little, intense, but it's not. The first reality is the concrete, that which we can touch, smell, taste, hear, see. And we start to engage in the concrete world before we're even born. Before we're even born, we can hear things that are happening on the outside. We can taste, we can begin to feel. And so we begin to process the world based on that data, that concrete data. But then we also have this abstract reality that we live in of ideas. And those ideas are real. They're absolutely real, like death, like love, like freedom, like community, the environment. You can't tell me the environment isn't real, or that love isn't real, or that death isn't real. But I can't go and touch, smell, taste, hear, see those concepts directly. I have to rely on what I can infer or what people tell me about those ideas to be able to understand them.
And since I'm going to just interrupt you real quick.
That's okay.
What's really important is that, Hayakawa, the language theorist, talks about how the best writers navigate in and out of the concrete and the abstract. And so I love that you're bringing this idea in, because that's what we're trying to teach our kids to do. So part of my interruption, but
okay.
Preach over here,
Uh-huh. Thanks. Well, and I like to think about it as So I have a almost 1.5-year-old son, and he is my absolute everything. And right now he's at the point, it's really cool. He's starting to have language and he's starting to have his own little personality and understand things. And like right now, I'm trying to teach him responsibility and sharing and kindness, but I can't sit down my 1-year-old and say, okay, Nolan, look, you're a whole 16 months old now. It's time that you understand your responsibility to the greater community that is this family, right? He's not going to understand that. But instead, if I hand him a baby wipe at the end of his meal and say, Nolan, clean, wipe, 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 and he wipes, and half the time he makes more of a mess than he is cleaning. But I say, good job, Nolan, that's being responsible. Thank you for cleaning. Eventually, Nolan is going to associate that white with, oh, mommy smiles, mommy is excited. Or if I want to teach him about sharing, I can't sit down my child and give him a lecture about sharing. I have to keep sharing Cheerios with him.
Right.
And eventually he's going to associate like, hey, when I give mommy a Cheerio, she smiles, she gets excited, and she gives me more Cheerios. And I'll explain good sharing, good sharing. And eventually he'll come to an understanding about sharing. But without that Cheerio, my kid's not going to learn sharing.
Right.
Right. So we do this with all arguments. We take our ideas and we argue them through something that we can touch, smell, taste, hear, see, because that's what we've got, right?
For sure.
All right. So when we're looking at this prompt in particular, it says, for decades, movies and music have included messages or labels to signal that they have material in them that some people may find troubling. Advocates for such things argue this is important to prevent people from being exposed to things they do not want to encounter. However, Erica Christakis, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
Thanks. A lecturer at the Yale Child Study Center says that free speech and the ability to tolerate offense are the hallmarks of a free and open society. Write an essay that argues your position on the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that prevents a defensible position, provide evidence to support your line of reasoning, explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning, and use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument.
And I love those bullet points because really what it means is write a good paper, right?
Yeah. It literally tells you what argument is, right?
And it's important to just know that those last set of directions aren't important. It's the prompt. Well, they are important, but it's the prompt itself that we're really trying to access here. By the way, just one real quick note here before you go on, is that there will be a document, a Google Doc that you can viewers can access in the description right down below that will combine your argument steps and what you do for breaking down the prompt with mine as well, so that people can copy and paste that and whatnot. But I just want to make sure that people knew that before you went on. So here we go. How do I break down the prompt according to Ms. La Liberty?
Okay, so the first thing we have to do is muddle through all that information to figure out what it is that we're actually being asked to take a position on. So, and a lot of the prompts on the AP exam are structured this way, where we have a little bit of information to help jog our background knowledge. I found in my experience that the AP gods typically give us something that we would have all had some experience with, but maybe we don't wake up thinking about every morning, and that's okay. So they give us this little background paragraph first, and then where it says write, that really is where we're being told what to do. So here, we need to isolate the topic first. And I call it the topic because sometimes we're talking about a concrete thing or a practice in society that are going to be used to argue the abstract ideas that are associated with it. This is the thing or behavior that we are arguing through and the way that we exemplify our values. But really, because we argue ideas, not things, it's okay, and it's really important to recognize that even though we're being asked explicitly, write an essay that argues your position on the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content, putting a sticker on something, like we're not arguing sticker, right? We're arguing to what extent or how, like what ideas are associated with using those warning labels to try to signal to people that there's potentially troubling content. So then our next step is going to be to identify those abstract ideas, because the stickers themselves, or like the rated R next to a movie, is a thing I can touch, smell, taste, hear, see.
Right. And one of the things that I want to just point out about this is I know that you and I share the same definition of rhetoric, which is, using language to construct meaning, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, we've got the concrete language, and then we've got the meaning, which is the abstraction. And this really helps follow. And this is why that's our foundational definition of rhetoric, because now in argument, everything still links the concrete and the abstract, just like what we're doing right here. So we're following the same methodology that we've introduced at the beginning of the class when we talk about rhetoric, and now we're even moving it into argumentation.
Right. And the benefit of having this streamlined definition is that kids can see the overlaps between all three writing tasks, the reading tasks and the writing, because this is what good readers do. So this is what we do in our writing.
Right.
Yeah. So the next step for me, and this is, I like to start in the prompt itself. So identify the abstract ideas that are explicitly listed in the prompt, remembering that abstract is anything we cannot touch, smell, taste, hear, see, but we know exists. Right. So in this particular prompt, for decades, movies and music have included messages or labels that signal that they have material in them that some people may find troubling. The concept of troubling is one that I'm like, okay, well, that's that's an emotion, first of all. So those are absolutely always abstract. So I'm going to grab that one. And it depends on your preference for how you want to do this, especially in the digital age. I'm a visual learner, so I color code everything. So I always go abstracts or red, so that it's like big stop signs in my reading. So some other explicit abstracts that, as I went through the prompt, free speech, tolerance, offense, free and open society, and potentially troubling content. Those were the ones that I saw on the page. And as I was reading, my brain was already starting to go in a couple different directions of other abstracts that I could add to that. So the next step is to brainstorm any abstract ideas that are implied or associated with the topic in the prompt, but may not be explicitly stated.
So let me get this straight. For step 2, I'm identifying the concrete abstracts, those ones that I can point to in the prompt.
Right.
And for step 3, I'm going to the abstract abstracts, which are, all right, now that I've got these abstract ideas, I'm going to relate them to other ones that are seemingly implied.
Right, because that's honestly what we're bringing to the table, right? A lot of times we ask our students, well, how is this argument original? Where are your ideas that you're bringing? And for me, I find that it's those abstract ideas that I can infer based on what I'm given in front of me that really starts to make me feel like I'm owning this.
Right. And that actually creates sophisticated thought, because we're bringing what we have to the table. And that's part of what sophistication is. You're not just repeating a prompt, you're actually bringing something more. And now we're teaching kids to access these prompts with something more. Excellent.
Thanks, Tim. So for here's again some examples. And I just went through and tried to come up with as many as I could picture my students coming up with. And it's okay if the list isn't exhaustive like this. The first couple times I do this with my students, I do have us bring together all 30 brains in the room and bring together as many options as possible. But as students start to do it on their own, it's okay if they go for a couple and then that they already start to feel their argument taking shape. They don't have to be this exhaustive every time.
Yeah, we don't need death by abstraction here. I totally get it, but this is great. But I always tell my kids when I give them examples like this, like, guys, this is someone who's thought about this a lot for many years, right? I'm hoping you can get 4 and then to build from there,
Right, exactly. Or when it takes us 3 days to do this as a whole class first, and they say, but how are we going to do this in 40 minutes? I like to remind my students, the first time you got in a car, you didn't just get out on the highway. It took you a while to think about where everything was, but now you just get in and turn the key and go. Right. So it's okay. Exactly. So for here, some examples. At first I pulled from the exact prompt, like the topic itself, because I like to start there before I go off into the background information. And
this actually right here is you using the concrete, right? The warning label and the warning message, that concrete moment, and you're still tying that to abstraction too. So that's that's a great way of kind of moving it into there as well. Get the kids comfortable with what they do know, that rated R or that little sticker.
Yes, absolutely. So for instance, with this warning labels and warning messages, some of those abstract ideas that come along with that are effectiveness, right? How many times have you been warned something and you still did it anyway?
Of course,
Right? Which I'm sure 17-year-olds are going to be able to relate to. What?
I said, maybe because I was warned, I did it, you know?
Yeah, exactly, right? Does it make it more appealing?
Yeah.
Control, like who is actually making those choices, either putting the label on or making the choices to buy it for somebody. Censorship, I'm sure the kids are going to go for choice, warning, judgment, and maturity. Like,
Yeah.
are you still, how is that label being used? Well, the assumption is that someone is mature enough to make that choice for someone else or know what's good for them. I also had this idea of potentially troubling content. Again, choice, free speech, safety, and offense, and it's okay if they overlap and you see them coming multiple times.
Yeah.
Another moment where I took from the concrete is movies and music. The
Right.
abstract ideas associated with that are art and expression. Troubling that some people may find troubling. I thought about peace, safety, values, and emotional health, right? Because especially a lot of our students are in the habit of using like trigger warnings now.
Yeah.
So that might be something to pull from, that they'll bring their background experience to. The fact that the person giving the position against warning labels is from the Child Study Center. That made me think of ideas about like healthy development and maturity. And I started thinking about my son. So some people might start to think about their little siblings. And all of this background knowledge is absolutely 100% valid and important to acknowledge.
Right. And also, by bringing up these ideas, as kids start to think even about how these elements relate to their own lives, that can totally help with providing examples as we write the essay later, of course,
Right.
what we're trying to jumpstart here. So absolutely
Right.
awesome.
One abstract idea I don't want to go through all of these, but one that I do want to point out to is the fact that I always challenge my students, and we're going to look at this later on in the prompt, but again, it's kind of one of those premises that we lay our course on,
Yeah.
is that rhetoric is communal.
Right.
So rhetoric is always about an exchange ideas between two people. So we're always kind of trying to think like, yes, need to draw upon my own experience, but how does this impact the society at large or the community at large? So when we're talking about free speech, it's not just about you being able to say what you want, but now we're talking about like rights in a society, and particularly the fact that we live in a democracy where part of the foundations of our society is based on the exchange of ideas and people disagreeing with each other.
Right.
So just always, and it's kind of funny because a lot of times my kids will be like, democracy, no matter what, but sometimes it works. So next now that we have all of these abstract ideas that we know are at play here, what we really need to do is pump the brakes and remind ourselves, what are we actually being asked to take a position on? And what does that look like in practice in the real world?
Because AP does not stand for agony and pain, right? Anxiety and pressure. It stands for the prompt.
Answer the prompt. Yep.
Abstractions as we want, but if we don't use them to answer the prompt, we're going to be in trouble. Right.
Exactly. Because remember that at the end of the day, like you pointed out, abstracts are very important, but we always need to argue through the concrete and make sure that we're arguing through the correct concretes and practices.
That's right.
What I like to do is put the prompt in my own words just to make sure that I wrap my head around what I'm being asked, and to remember that arguments typically are moving toward the future, because we want to know, is this something to continue with?
Yeah.
Or when we go to make decisions, how are we going to approach this? You're sort of making a recommendation a lot of times.
Right.
So for that, I changed it to, should warning labels and warning messages be used? Like that really is the meat and potatoes of what we're being asked, right? Should. Right. So then I have to determine the ideas that we're being asked to prioritize or value within that. So we have all these abstract ideas, but is it that we're being asked to say, okay, if you were given a menu of 10 things to consider, are these the 2 that are most important? Or are we being asked to prioritize and say, well, these 2 things exist, but is one more important than the other,
Yeah.
right? So here, the abstract values or ideas in question that I see that I kind of like grabbed onto at first, where are free speech, art, and expression more important than an individual's values and health? If you think that those are two separate things, and this might look different for you.
Yeah.
Do warnings take away a person's choice? Who judges what is offensive and who controls censorship? And is tolerance important to individual development in society? Those are sort of the ideas that I see being opposed to one another, or that we could play with for the value.
Yeah.
So when I'm being asked, okay, well, how are these abstract ideas being put into practice through the prompt? Really, what I'm coming up with is, to what extent does the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content benefit or harm the community? And then my job is to take those, the tipping scale of the abstracts and say, well, which one is more important, right? How do these benefit society? And then that really is where I create my own argument.
Right. And then, with all these questions that are here, we can clearly start to say, okay, how can I start putting my ideas and projecting my claim? We don't have to do that yet because we're just talking about breaking down the prompt. But I mean, there are so many things to think about now. And then, rather than have thought overload, though, we can point kids to say, okay, well, what 2 questions do you want to answer that do answer this prompt, right? Should labels be used, right?
Right.
And we can focus on that. So this is great because we're getting all of the brainstorming ideas out here. And if we practice this before May, a couple times, you're absolutely right. Kids will be able to do this rather quickly. The first time it does take 3 to 4 class periods. I do the same thing with my kids. And then they're like, oh man, how are we going to do this? And it's like, just trust us.
Yeah.
Practice.
Yeah.
It'll be okay.
Right. This is the collective, this is the 30 brain, example, but it just trust the process, internalize it, because it is a process. So then lastly,
a long time and have had a lot of success. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I tell the kids, I'm like, guys, every year my kids ask the same question and they do just fine. So you're going to be
right. So lastly, the thing that, like you were saying, part of the navigating the overload too is, don't ignore your gut. You're going to have your life experiences. You're going to have the questions that you gravitate toward. If you're an artist, right, you're probably going to be looking at that warning label with disdain before you even begin to, brainstorm your abstracts. But then what you're doing is you're giving yourself language to be able to explain why your gut tells you this is bad.
Yeah.
Or for me, as I mentioned, as a new parent, thinking about the choices that I make for my kid, or as a teacher, the choices that I make for my kids, my gut might be telling me that it's nice to have a little bit of a warning as to what I'm allowing my kids to access. And then, but I also want control. I want to be able, at the end of the day, to say, I'm the mom. Like, I choose if my kids get to see that. So my gut reaction was, where it says, should warning labels or warning messages be used to signal potentially troubling content, was, within reason, right? Like, my brain stops me from going like, yes, absolutely, all the time. And where it stops me is that whole, like, I'm the mom. So I want to think back to some of my questions that I generated and some of the abstract ideas. So I'm going to write down my position first, right? Like, my gut reaction tells me that warning labels and warning messages should be used to signal potentially troubling content if people have the freedom to make their own choices based on those labels. Like, as long as you're telling me it's not like I can never show that to my kid, but I can use that as more information, I'm happy. That's what my gut tells me.
Now, can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Yes, please do.
Right under that number 5, under gut reaction, those 4 bullet points, the absolutely always, the yes, when, if, the no, unless, and then the never. I mean, that's such an excellent tool to give kids, because even if you just have them circle one of those at first and be like, boom, just circle that, we're good. To get them thinking about it, because that's going to help generate a claim. And if we talk about it in class, I really think that most of the time, the more sophisticated arguments are the ones that see the limitations as opposed to going fully absolute. Right. And so when we have a couple of kids that do the fully absolute, we can actually get that change to happen when we say, okay, who doesn't have a fully absolute? Who does? And let's get a conversation going. And then we could see that kind of argument grow together.
Absolutely. When we have the luxury of being in person safely,
Yeah.
my favorite activity to do this is, and we all do some sort of version of this, like a social barometer.
Yeah.
I do it with my 4 walls, and I actually have those positions laminated on just paper that I just use like duct tape and put them up on each wall. But the thing is, a kid has to take a wall, so
Yeah.
you can't just like sit in the middle.
Right.
And then we go through and we exchange ideas, and the kids can move. So
Yeah.
what's funny is a lot of times the kids will call each other out because they might go to the absolutely always, and 99% of the time the absolutely always kid concedes in
Yeah.
discussions, and the people in the yes when if will say, well, then you need to come over here.
Yeah.
You know. So in the digital age, I've been trying to find the best ways to do this. I think my gut tells me to kind of set up a Google Doc that looks like the page that I'm on right now, and let all the kids have editing rights and put their names into the 4 positions. And then as you go through, if they want to move, they could.
Right.
Might be a fun way to do it. But then the very last thing I do, and this is sort of getting into the next step, which is adding complexity or developing your thesis, but I just don't want to ignore all those abstract ideas that we did all that good thinking with right now.
Yeah.
So I like to add a because. This is a closed thesis statement, which I know some people are not a fan of, but especially in an exam answer, and as you talk about in your video about topic sentences, you want to make your thesis or your main claim as clear and as focused toward the direction of your essay as possible.
Yeah.
Right. So this is where I grab my at least two reasons. And remember, reason is thinking. So reasons are abstract. So my final gut reaction developed with my because would be warning labels or warning messages should be used to signal potentially troubling content, because people should have the ability to make choices based on their own values. And warnings do not prevent people from accessing free speech altogether.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. And, that's totally going to keep it all together. We've got a because that will unify a paper, and that actually creates a strong line of reasoning. And truth be told, Crystal, if you're cool with me doing this, when I make my argument line of reasoning video and paragraphing, I might actually just work with that thesis as well as the one that I wrote. If you're cool with that.
You go for it, my friend. Yeah, because this creates a roadmap, right? An easy organization to teach kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So there we go. There's Crystal's 5 steps in terms of breaking this down. Right. And once again, we'll be able to access this down below. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask that you stop sharing your screen, because I'm going to share up my screen and go through my 5 steps. And we can actually see where there's going to be some overlap here. I am not going to fully get into sophisticated thesis mode here today. But, stopping at breaking down the prompt and then saying kids don't write a thesis or don't do something with an argument, I do think is quite foolish. So I think that, at least at the very end, get them to have that gut reaction, which is where I typically stop before we then generate examples. It doesn't matter though, because if you even get the kids to produce that because statement at the beginning, they've been thinking about it complexly. And then as always, right now, because it's not exam day, kids can go back and revise, which is super important. All right, so I'm going to share up my screen here. And Crystal is going to join us, and she's going to build I'm sure, a thrilling critique of what I've got going. But it's the same prompt here, so we're not going to reread that here, and we're going to go through my steps that are presented in the same exact format. So if anybody wants to mix and match these steps, that's fine. But if you do, I do ask that you share them back with me and share them back with Crystal as well, because chances are, like, I give out stuff all the time and people make it like 10 times better. And then they share it back with me and I'm like, oh, you've been letting me do it the lame way for so long when you've made so it's important to do. Let me just make sure that my highlighters are working. Yep, they're working. Good. So my first step here is similar to Crystal's, but mine actually just streamlines the process a little bit, just because I don't get as in depth with the separation of ideas and things. What I typically do is my first step is going to be called the Springboard. And really what I do is I look for the position and I look for the assumptions that show up in the prompt. So I'm just trying to say, okay, what positions have they given us? Because the College Board will typically give you positions in your prompts so that you have something to jumpstart with. And then I say, what are the assumptions about those positions or the assumptions of how they're tied together? And sometimes the prompt itself is actually given, there's an assumption in the prompt itself. Not with this particular one, but I'll give an example of one as I go to that step. But anyway, we have the positions from this particular one, and you'll notice that I've got one position that says, warning labels allow people not to encounter troubling material. And it implies that this is appropriate. This is appropriate to do. The other position that's concretely accessible, I just put it in my own words, and it just says tolerating offense is an integral part of a free society. So now I know that there are a couple of different perspectives here. Now, this does lead to an assumption though, and I'll highlight that in pink, okay? And that's going to be this last one right down here. So although they're separated as different positions, because they're juxtaposed in the prompt, there's an assumption that seems to correlate here that they're trying to push us into considering, and that is that applying warning labels may negatively affect an individual's ability to tolerate offense. Now that may or may not be true. I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough yet, but I want to get that assumption out because that might be a way that I can approach my paper. A couple other assumptions that show up in the prompt, right? In the first line, it talks about how for years and decades, movies and music have been given ratings and video games are now given ratings and whatnot. That would suggest that the media is full of troubling content. And if I can easily prove that true, I might be able to do something there. Is it full of troubling content? Yeah, okay. Should be warned for troubling content? Potentially so. So I've got that assumption. And then I've got one other assumption in here is that, and this is the one that is key for me, it's that troubling content is consistently definable. And this becomes incredibly intriguing for me because if it is consistently definable, then we wouldn't argue about what's censored and what's not. But we do happen to consistently argue about what's censored and what's not, or what's given a label and what's not, or how things are labeled. And so now if I go through and I just break it down into these quick little, hey, how can I springboard ideas with perspectives? I can then say to myself, how do I feel about this? Then I can just put a little plus or minus next to it. I could say, okay, warning labels can be appropriate at times. Yeah, I'm pretty cool with that. All right. Tolerating offense is an integral part of a free society. Yeah, I believe that to be true as well. The media is filled with offensive content. Oh, I could picture plenty. But when I get down here, is it consistently definable? I'm like, what one person defines as offensive might not be what somebody else defines as offensive. And I'm like, I need to think about that a little bit more. And now all of a sudden I can start getting my ideas, churning about this in my own way, right? And then warning labels actually apply to the ability to tolerate an offense. I'm not sure if I believe that. And so I'm going to just put a little minus right here. And notice that I'm starting to see, where do I fit here? And if I've got more pluses than minuses, then I'm going to say, okay, that makes it seem as though I'm kind of leaning towards, hey, warning labels are not a bad thing to put on items. And so now, though, I have to recognize that this one right here gets really dicey because this is where I have to concede something. What if not everybody agrees that that should be censored? And this is helping me kind of get, springboard some thoughts here. Okay. And that actually shows you what I just did here is exactly what I talk about in step 2, which is initial thoughts, right?
Tim,
Yep.
sorry. Do you find that working kids through identifying the assumptions takes a little work? Is that
absolutely?
Yeah.
Right? Also, in argument language, a lot of people call this the Tolman element. Okay. Yes. Because it's in argument language in the Tolman model, they call it the warrant, right? So what's the implied assumption about this, right? I don't particularly use the Tolman language here. It just confuses kids. And really, these assumptions end up becoming commentary in their papers. So I'll just say, okay, what's the assumption here? Because this is how we would provide commentary about how we feel. But it is hard to get kids. Well, it takes time the first time to get kids to do it. But if you do this with 2 prompts in front of them and you show them how to access these assumptions that are down here, then they can get it no problem. And then all of a sudden the kids are like, okay, here's what I have to support or not support with evidence throughout my paper. But yes, you're absolutely right. So like I said, with step 2, I'm just taking those positions and I'm marking plus and minus here. What do I agree with? What do I not agree with? And you'll notice that, tolerating offense is an integral part of a free society. Can I prove that to always be true? I don't know. I've already rethought about that. But now this is going to help me get my position here. Okay. Now, the last element that or should I say, one of the more important elements that I want to point out is that if you were to watch any of my videos about rhetorical analysis, I always put the prompt into what I call my command and conquer method. And the command always tells me what I have to do. And the conquer allows me to create a question that will help me to conquer my essay, right? And Crystal, you've been hearing me say that for thousands of years, it seems like, right?
Yeah, it's all right. Kids love it.
It's great. It's like, hey, let's go to war with the exam and let's actually conquer it, right?
Right.
But the way that you find the command in the argument prompt, right? In question 2, it's always finding the word analyze, but in question 3, it's always finding the word argue. And what we do is if you look down here, you're going to find that command, argue, and it goes all the way to the end of the sentence. So in this case, it's argue a position on the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content, okay? And then what we do is from that command down at the end, we're gonna just try to find what's not answered yet. And it's always best to try to ask a what question first. But a how question is also appropriate in when it comes to argument. And the reason why is because what questions are easy to answer. Crystal, what's your favorite thing to do?
Be with my baby
There you go. How do you know?
because it makes me happy all the time.
How does it make you happy?
Ooh, that is a more difficult question.
And that's my point here, right? So we want to ask the what question because we can respond to that the most immediately. So that's why we want to start with what. We can go to how, but how gets a little bit dicey with us here.
Right.
And so, we want to start with what. And so if I look at all of this language, I just say what's not identified for me yet. And you're going to notice I've already highlighted it. It says argue a position on the use of warning labels or warning messages to signal potentially troubling content. The only thing that I don't know here yet is what my position is. And so now I'm going to ask the question, what is my position on the use of warning labels? I need to think about that. But if I've already made my little marks here, I already kind of know. I'm mostly for that. Okay, super cool. Another way I could actually also create this question is by saying to what extent should a warning label be used to signal potentially troubling content? And the reason why to what extent also typically works really well for these questions is because that allows us not to have to always go black and white. But Crystal, in yours, it was awesome because you gave those 4 little bullet points. So we're doing something very similar. Always,
Right.
never, and then a little bit in between. And so that's a great way we could have combined these methodologies, if we were colleagues.
Right. And I can say that was born out of so many of my students really seeing complexity, but being unable to articulate the complexity. And so they would say, it's sometimes okay. But then, and as you're going to move forward, it's like, okay, well, where's the sometimes?
Right.
So,
Right. And you have to talk about the sometimes before you could talk into the, but here's where I really stand.
yes.
Excellent. And what's also nice about these questions is to get kids to actually take a position. So even if there's a concession, it does highlight their position. So we're not equivocating the whole time. Right. So we find our command, we create these questions. And when I have my kids create these questions, this leads to my last step, which is just what's your initial reaction? And in your case, it was what's your gut reaction that you then turned into a little bit more complex. I don't do that because I typically have my kids do evidence next before they create their complex thesis, but it doesn't matter. These are both great ways to do it because we both had a lot of success. And I just have the kids in a quick, simple sentence, and I actually tell them, try not to use a subordinating conjunction. Try not to use any of that kind of, I don't want a compound sentence right now. I don't want a complex sentence right now. One subject and verb is good enough for me. And they try to answer it right there so that they can at least know their position before they actually, or their initial position at least, and I'll allow them to change.
Mhm.
So, nonetheless, right, we will have this document in the description. I've already mentioned that here right now. Crystal, I'm going to let you close with any final words that you have to say, and then we'll call it a day.
I just thank you for letting me be here, my friend. Thank you for letting me do this. I love, just the ability to get kids to be confident in sharing their ideas is just the magic of this course, right?
Oh,
So
I absolutely agree. And right, Crystal, I also want to say thank you again to coming. And for everybody that's watching, I want you to keep your eyes out for Crystal in the AP world. I'm sure that she's going to blow up within the next 2 years. There's no doubt about it. Okay. A couple other things I want to just point out while I close things up. First of all, we do have this poster back here, which was inspired by Crystal, by the way, when she started talking about argue ideas and not things. And what I did was I actually went through all old synthesis prompts and argument prompts, and I picked out those abstractions and I put them into columns here, right? So you can actually pick these up at the Garden of English shop, which is in the links down below. You can also pick it up at my website, and you can actually get downloadable copies for a smaller fee than at the shop. These are one of the few things that I actually sell, as you all know that I typically try to give things out for free. On top of that, you can follow the Garden of English on Facebook. You can also follow us on Instagram. We always appreciate your support, and I hope that you all have a great day, and I hope that you guys could pull something out of here that you could either use in your classroom or you as a student can use as you begin to continue to learn how to plan for your paper. By all means, we're extremely accessible, so feel free to reach out to me, and I'm willing to bet that I could even get Crystal to agree to give out her contact information.
absolutely, Tim.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
All right, Crystal, it was super nice to see you. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.